Welcome back to another episode of the Tommy Brideson Show. I want to talk and run through some different causes of lower back pain in an active lifter. Now, lower back pain is probably one of the most relevant and prevalent injuries or pain point that people feel when they're in the gym. And a lot of cases, the back pain itself isn't necessarily like catastrophic. Don't get me wrong, it can be. If you have a disc issue or you have something that's, putting pressure on a nerve, it can be really, really bad. But the reality is for the active lifter, in most cases, the pain is, a contribution of muscle tightness, a contribution of, increasing training volumes and strength. And we, as humans, we will always find a way to work around things. And that's a really cool thing for survival. But what ends up happening is we will always find a way to get a job done in most cases, and we will create compensatory movement patterns. We will find a way around things. So just to put an example on that, if I was trying to do a hinge-based movement like a deadlift and I went to hinge and I didn't have enough range of movement through my glutes and my hamstrings, I would likely just round out through my back and tuck my hips under to increase the range that I have available to me. Even though it's not directly coming through my glutes and my hamstrings, I'm still going to get that range of movement to sort of perform that task. Now, that's not particularly efficient and it's not the best way to do things. But in saying that, it's a really cool survival strategy. But when we have a look at the active lifter, we can assume that training technique is good for the most part. And, we're always working on training technique, but the work component of an active lifter is really important to think about. And I think, the people that I treat and work with in person, all of them are training, 3 to 5 times a week. They're putting a solid amount of effort in and, they're increasing their training volume, they're increasing their strength, and they're kicking goals, right? So the back pain that they present with in a lot of time, even though it hurts, at the time can be a catalyst from so many different areas. I think something to think about with pain as well, especially when we're thinking of the lower back, is your back pain is heightened to give you a warning sign, to tell you and tell your body that, hey, something's wrong, something needs to be addressed. Can we slow down a little bit and just take a look at it before we continue to progress? And over time, if you ignore that, it starts to build up and it becomes worse and worse and worse, and we get this flow-on effect. And I think if we have a look at, like, say for instance, I have a power lifter that we're using a deficit deadlift to increase how much leg drive they have available in a deadlift, or increase the awareness of leg drive, increase the overall range of movement to help with, building some muscle mass and capacity. But I give that particular exercise to someone that is really immobile. We might run into some issues there where they can do the movement and the movement looks fine, but they haven't got the available range of movement at the hips. So I'll end up compensating in order to get in the right position. So, as an athlete or as someone that's really active in the gym, we're really good at figuring things out, and sometimes it can be to our detriment. But what I wanted to delve in today was back pain, common causes of it, and how to address it. Because most people, it's a very simple fix, especially if you've got rehab and, prehab stuff integrated into your training process. Now, I wanted to sort of break out a few different common points because I've had a full week of treating and back on the tools, and a lot of the issues that have come through have actually stemmed from the hips, but you feel it upstream in the back. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but I think with someone that's tight, I think years ago it was all about, get glute strength, get core strength, strengthen those up, and you basically won't have back pain. But anyone that works with a really active population realizes that your glutes aren't weak. And if you look at a powerlifter side on or someone that builds muscle mass side on, they have really developed and defined glutes. So it's not a lack of muscle mass or a weakness that's, causing that pain. In most cases, there's a length, it's called a length tension relationship. So, if you think front and back and side to side, you have all these muscles pulling, and they can only be 50% pulling at each time because the balance side of that is 100%. So say my anterior core and then my lumbar spine. If I'm holding 75% tension through my erectors in my lumbar spine, I've only got 25% of tension left from my ab wall. And the problem is with that is we feed into that. So say I am really sort of extended in that position where my lower back is going to be working a lot. The front of my hips is going to be working a lot as well. But the problem with that is our body sees that as a position of strength. Our body sees it as a position that we can get stability from. And from that point, it then further feeds into that, which means that there's less tension left for the abs and there's less tension left for the glutes. So when we're looking at treating and assessing, we need to take into account like people's default position, because tension actually can just be an area that's working a lot for you and it just needs a break. Or it actually can be an injury, So there's different ways of looking at it. If someone's had an acute fall and, they've fallen off a ladder and landed on their butt, very different conversation to someone that's just been doing a lot of volume deadlifting and is feeling really jacked up through the back. So I think it's important to look at, there's injuries and there's acute injuries, but then there's also just dealing with the active lifter. Now, if we look at some common complaints of pain, I would say in the lower back area specifically, SI sort of related pain around that sort of, that lower back area, but more so to one side, and also can radiate and wrap around the hip. You've got hip impingement pain, which is that really deep hip pain that when, for instance, you go into, hip flexion, you pull your knee up towards your chest, it grabs, it's very deep. It's your hip. So a hip impingement type pain, but because of that pain, you then get pain in other areas like your back or your knee and the flow and effect of that. You do have nerve-based issues as well, where nerves can, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disc-based issue, but a nerve can come entrapped within a tissue or within a structure, which will then cause very similar pain that a nerve, like radiculopathy, like a pressure on an actual nerve root will cause you. But the issue with it is it's actually not from the disc. It's more out on the periphery, out in the actual tissue itself. So you can get a lot of pain from that as you start to build more muscle mass and more tension. But the other one is actually just getting mad back pumps. Now, I know that sounds weird, but if you've worked with anyone that does like strength training, for instance, and they've done a lot of squats or they've done a lot of deadlifts, the back pumps that you get can be debilitating. There is a reason for it, but they can be debilitating because you just get so much blood and so much tension in your back. And don't get me wrong, you build up resilience, you build up strength, you build up tension in that area, but sometimes it just holds so much of the load because it thinks it's a stability point that it causes a lot of discomfort. So I want to sort of just break out some of the common causes there and sort of how to look for them. So if we start off with like SI-based pain, you've got to look at whether your SI-based pain is an instability, like there's too much movement, or it's the opposite side. You've actually got a compressive base pain. Now, compressive base pain would just imagine these are two bones and you're pushing two bones together and you're getting pain from them basically knocking against each other. Where instability, say that's your hip joint and that's the moving leg, it's from because you don't have the control, then the actual head of the bone jams into the hip socket. So looking at it from the outside, you might go, oh, they're presenting as the same pain, but they're actually two very different treatment plans out of that, or management strategies out of that. So you'll find someone that is more on the hypermobile side of things, they have a little bit more movement, or, which is very common, someone that has a big rotation pattern in the way that they move. Like when someone squats, you can see that sometimes they shift weight a lot. You'll find that in those cases, you'll find the person that shifts weight a lot, they'll have a really, really, really stiff side, but then on the opposite side of that, they'll have a side that moves a little bit more. So that's a little bit of a telltale sign there that you have like an asymmetry, like a rotation from left to right. So you'll find that quite often you have one side of the pelvis that's actually compressive, but then you have the opposite side that's an instability. But that's all caused by a functional rotation. So I don't want to get too caught up in the weeds here, but when you're assessing a hip, a compressive based SI pain can really be shown as someone that doesn't have the adequate range of movement to say get into hip flexion, internal rotation, because there's so much tension in that hip. A lot of the time it's compressed in the TFL, the glute medius, the side glute, like the glute min, and also the glute max. And the tissue's done so much work that it causes compression at the joint. So the treatment for that is actually a mobility-based plan so that when that knee comes up towards your chest, there's not as much restriction. But if we have a look at someone on the opposite side that's on the instability side, and say, for instance, my right leg is really, really, really tight at the front of my hip, like, you know, the high quad into the adductor, that sort of front internal component of my hip. What that means is my leg is so locked into that position that it makes it really hard to access my glute. It makes it really hard to get that extension torque from my glute and my hamstring. That there is more of an instability because you have less muscle tension in the back of the hip, right? So you've got this leg that's moving around without control from one side. So the treatment strategy, yes, there will be a mobility component to treating the front of that hip, the anterior and medial hip, but we also then need to look at upregulating some of those weak points, like increasing the glute tension that you can create or the stability in the actual hip itself. So presentation-wise, you might do all your testing for SI pain and it's positive, but the treatment strategies and the plan out of it can be completely different. So that's something that we see in active lifters a lot. Now, following on for that is hip impingements. You can have like a functional hip impingement or you can have a structural. Now, like a structural is like a bony defect or the way that your actual hip joint is made up, which we're not going to talk about today. But the functional one is what I want to talk about more so. And quite often we can get these functional hip impingements through a lack of range of movement, see the common theme, and instability as well. So if you haven't got control in your hip joint, for instance, and you haven't got, you know, one side of the muscle group slowing down movement, it basically leaves the bone to just move around at its free will. You're not controlling any of that movement. So you can end up in a situation where the bone is banging against another bone. So say that's the femur, the head of the femur, and that's your hip socket, the acetabulum. You can just bang the two bone pieces together because there's a lack of control or there's a lack of contribution from a muscle group at the back of the hip, right? So part of that particular treatment strategy would be, again, to be upregulating the areas that you've treated and you've found to be weak or you've assessed and found to be weak, and then, you know, potentially downregulating any of the tension spots that are, you know, causing this functional asymmetry. But then on the other side of things, which I think in an active lifter, especially in someone that's pushing lower body strength and hypertrophy, you'll find that a lot of times you get a functional impingement of the hip, but it's compressive because it's actually locked down anteriorly at the front of the hip. So a lot of what we look at when we look at hip impingements or bringing bones together, it can be in the ankle, hip, whatever, we often look at the backside of it. But in all honesty, in someone that's really active, like someone that's squatting a lot, for instance, the front of the hip gets so tight because we're constantly flexing the hip. And if you think about it, if this is the front of your hip, it pulls the joint surfaces together. So then as my leg starts to move up, I run out of space and I run into that bone. So it's bone hitting bone, causing pain, which then has a flow-on effect. If I don't have that range of movement, I'm then going to feed that upstream into my back, right? So this is the body's strategy. So if I'm squatting, but I don't have the range of movement because of a hip impingement, I will then just move upstream, either into my lower back, or I'll get the movement further downstream in my knee and my ankle. So the body's very smart at finding strategies to get around things. But the reality is sometimes it comes as a warning sign of pain, more so seen in the lower back. So when we're having a look at the actual hip joint itself, it often is a cause of pain, of lower back pain. Now, it's not always going to be the case, but it is a real life thing. And I think the more and more I treat people, the more and more I actually move away from treating the back, because I like to think about the back as a messenger. And it's an area I've spoken about it before, but the body is stacked on top of each other, and you've got certain joints that are movers and you've got certain joints that are meant to be sort of stabilizing and holding in a position throughout a movement. Now, it doesn't mean that the back can't move, but the lower back isn't a mover. It's a stabilizer. It's meant to stay in a fixed position, mostly through positions, and then you're getting the movement at the hip joint, you're getting the movement at the knee and the ankle and above the back. So it's just staying in the middle, and it's holding weight because it's resisting the force, but it's not necessarily doing the movement for you. It's controlling movement. So I think a lot of the issues stem from the fact that we just put a lot of work through certain areas, which means that yes, the back is going to work further. Yes, the hips are going to work further, but that can result in pain. So sometimes I think we go too far into a rabbit hole of, trying to diagnose this crazy, pain science, when really we need to sort of take a little bit of a step back when we're working with an active lifter and go, okay, it's not, say for instance, it's not a disc-based issue. Can we actually just think about training for a moment and think about how this person is trying to move, thinking about what movement patterns they're doing over and over and over again, and assess the movement patterns, assess if there is a functional difference from left to right, front to back, side to side, and go all in on fixing that, because quite often the back pain is a result of the hips. So if I go and say, for instance, my hips are super tight and all I do is treat the lower back, more often than not, the person will feel so much worse after treatment. And the reason being is that area is actually creating stability and tension to try and stabilize something. And then you've gone and you've loosened it up. So it's actually gotten further destabilized, but you haven't addressed any of the range of movement issues at the hip. So see, that's a problem, because they might leave the session feeling good, but you've left their back feeling loose. So it's sort of relieved a little bit of the symptoms, but you haven't addressed the real root cause, which is the hips. So that leads me into postural adaptations. And when we look at, everyone has different body types and different makeups, and, I'm not going to delve into what they all are, but you'll generally find some people that are more sort of like lordotic. They're more like anteriorly rotated. Their pelvis rotates forward. They have a bit more of a hunchback, and then you'll find, based on different sports and different body types, some people will be the complete opposite of that. Someone that's a really active lifter, we are more biased towards that sort of lordotic type posture, but forcing extension through the upper body at the same time. And the reason for that is we maintain that position. Like we're squatting, we're hinging, we're deadlifting. And the way that we have to hold ourselves to be strong is more in that lordotic, because we don't want to, let our back fall into a flex position, because that's where we're going to get a disc-based issue happen. So someone that is more in that like anteriorly lordotic style position, they will find that they will get a lot more discomfort in pain through the front of the hips, from a mobility standpoint. That's always constantly working and shortened. And the functional opposite of that is actually the lower back. So the hips and the lower back work together. And when they're really switched on and they're holding a lot of this weight, what ends up happening is every time you do something that's stressful, every time you get fatigued, every time the intensity, like the load goes up, you feed into that for stability, and your body is searching for that because it goes, I know I can do work there. But over time that builds up, and you get quite sensitive in these areas, and they need some deloading. They need some length in the tissue. They need to just relax a little bit so that they're not constantly working, because something that's constantly contracting over and over and over again, even when you're not training, eventually it's going to cause you pain. Now, in the active lifter, I am going to say that 90% of the time, a lot can be addressed through some very simple movement strategies. And there are different trains of thought. Some people are like, anti-prehab, anti-rehab, anti-treatment, anti-manual therapy. But then you've got some groups that really like it. And the reality is someone that's pushing forward needs both. And if you work with people in person, not just read a research paper, you work with people in person and you see the real-time results that they get and how it feels from a pain standpoint, but you also see the performance output, you get that people need both. And it doesn't have to be from a treatment standpoint. It can be from just really selective drills in their warm-ups, or really selective drills outside of training program, outside of the actual training session itself. So having things to offset, and I say this all the time, but having some strategies in your program weekly to offset the tension in the main working areas, and in this case the hips, will pay dividends in your lower back pain. Because if your hips are moving well, it doesn't mean that we need to be the most supple person, but we have enough range of movement to perform the tasks that you need to do day in and day out in training and in life. You'll find that as a result of that, you get less lower back pain. You get less of the discomfort because there's less restriction into movement. So even as myself, for example, the other day over the Christmas break, I didn't do as much of my movement and prehab that I historically would do through a training week. And even just sort of I was doing some gardening and bending over, even that I was like, wow, I can actually feel that stiffness because I was still doing a lot of output. I was still training the normal amount. I was doing a lot more activity, sort of hiking and at home and in the garden and stuff, but I wasn't doing my movement based stuff. So you can start to feel that restriction build up really, really quickly. And I think, from a training standpoint, as someone that's lifting, if you start to feel yourself really stiff and restricted in terms of getting into the positions that you need to get into, in training, or it's harder to warm up, it's probably time to book in a proactive treatment session or reach out to your coach or whoever you're working with to get some strategies to put into your training program so that you can offset some of the tension in your system. And I think, that is the superpower here for back pain, especially is, you want to be onto it early and you want to make sure that you have enough movement early rather than having to wait to a point where you have an actual painful episode, an acute episode, and then have to reverse engineer it. You want to be on it before that even gets to the point. But, the unfortunate thing about pain and training and stuff like that, often we need an acute incident to then make us a little bit more aware of, how to look after our body long-term. But, in an ideal world, we would get the warning signs earlier and understand the importance of them. So ethos to this is if you feel like your body is really, really stiff, or your hips are really stiff, or your upper body is really stiff, it will pay absolute dividends for you to go and get some treatment or add some movement-based strategies in there. In terms of lower back pain, a lot of the time in the active lifter, it comes from the hips. Doesn't discredit the back because you do definitely get back pain, but it does. So I would always start in the initial session or in your initial coaching session to actually make sure that you're looking at the hips as well as not just assessing the back. Now, that's it for me today's episode, and I'll see you guys in the next one.